All right, continuing on with American literature, 1700 to 1820, part three. Another really important event was the Boston Tea Party. Here's another, notable and memorable event that I think most of us remember from our earliest studies of American history, where uh, colonists protested against tax on tea, so that they dressed up like Native Americans and they dumped it in the harbor. Um, this was their way of protesting what they saw as taxation without representation. Now, that tea was not necessarily theirs, but they took it and they pretty much destroyed it. And if we think about some of the political and social unrest that has been happening recently, some of that tradition harkens back to America's earliest beginnings. Now, what is important for us to think about is whether or not that particular political action then or now was politically justified. Now, that's something worthy of our discussion and something that we should think about. But it also depends on us really understanding both the history of that time and our history and the actual social and political climates. So there's a lot of unpacking to do with that. But I think you can make a pretty strong case for it. I'm not saying that violence is the answer to everything, and I'm not saying that looting necessarily makes problems go away. But what I am saying is that there is a certain amount of protest that is inherent in the American tradition, and some of that does involve a certain amount of property damage in some cases. So it's something for us to think about and put into historical context. And imperial politics also becomes even more heated the closer we get to 1776. Here was a political cartoon, and here at the bottom it says, "The able doctor, or America, swallowing the bitter draft." And here what you see is America, interestingly, being seen as, portrayed as a Native American, and a female one at that too. So there's an interesting gender layer to this too. This sense of violation. Sometimes when a society or a community gets plundered, sometimes it's called a rape. It doesn't mean an actual literal rape, but there is this almost sexualized sense of violation here. That could be a whole essay in itself. And what we see here in the background are various high up nobles and aristocrats that are enforcing this kind of imperialistic treatment upon the colonies. Now, what we also see here is that the draft being poured down this representation or this personification of America is tea. So the whole idea is the colonists are forced to be taking this tea by the British against their will. And we've got another noble here who was a womanizer in real life. I think it's Lord Sandwich. And here we have the personification of Great Britain and the British Empire, known as Britannia. And notice she's kind of looking away in shame and disgrace. So there's a lot going on here. But this also brings us to a really important point about the imperial, or if we want to call it colonial, and even later on revolutionary politics, is that print culture and the ability to mass produce images and text is really essential to gaining widespread support for the revolution and for turning public sentiment away from the British Empire. And here we got a nice engraving of the printing press, and this is around 1800. But here we do notice that we've got somebody working with all the type set here. That the ability to print newspapers and pamphlets and political journals really helps spread information fast. And here we've got an example of one of the newspapers that was being published at the time of the Revolution, called the Massachusetts Spy. Notice it says join or die underneath, and it's got all of these different snake sections with the different colony names here, right? You've got New England, which is just one at this point, New York, New Jersey, etc. Over 50 newspapers were being published at the time of the revolution. Look at this one. It's 1774. We're getting really close here. Here's like a close-up of that image. You notice it'd be a really easy thing to print, and it gets across information in an almost immediate way. And it makes colonists start to think that they themselves are better served and better protected by uniting. And that does end up being the case. Of course, the huge irony of these struggles for independence is that the independence was only for a certain portion of the American population. Slavery, like I said before, is still a hugely profitable and prevalent trade practice in the colonies. So much so, it was just part of business in the newspapers. And here we have what's called an advertisement for slaves that are going to be sold. To be sold on board the ship Vance Euland, it looks like, on Tuesday. There's that funky S that looks like an F on the 6th day, from windward in the Rice Coast, etc. And they might as well be selling furniture. It's, again, what a lot of historians call America's original sin, and that is slavery. And again, even though we're talking about this revving up and this moving and hurtling towards revolution and towards independence, that independence is still very much contingent on your subject position, your gender, your race, and your economic status. And here, just for illustration, we have the interior of a slave ship, Vigilante, where we do see slaves being basically stored just like cargo. A lot of us know these stories already. Here they are. Here's a cross section of where they are just laying down. A lot of them died on the way. They got sick or ill, and they were just thrown overboard. And here are the different shackles and manacles that were used on them as well. So once again, a really dark point in American history. And here's an illustration from the time showing a slave sale. Notice it says Negro auction, Negroes for sale here. And once again, we all know that, families were separated. Slaves were property, and yet they are largely responsible for a lot of the very quick wealth that was generated in the New World. You might even be able to make the argument that the colonies wouldn't have been able to be rich enough to rebel against the British Empire if it were not for their heavily slave-dependent but extremely successful colonial economies, including those of manufacturing and agriculture. And of course, we talked a little bit about where they are in newspapers here, and here we have another advertisement, or advertisement as they called it back in that day, of a runaway slave. Tells what he's wearing, duck trousers, homespun shirt, and all of these kinds of things. And there's even a bounty out on them for them to be returned alive. So again, a really troubling part of the earliest American histories, and something that we still need to be aware about today. And finally, one more element that we can look at will be the way in which the War for Independence was really fought so that Americans could form their own government, but women were still also considered subservient to men. We've got this very nice illustration done by Robert Dighton in 1784, or roughly around there. That's what circa means. And it's all about the role of women in contemporary society, or within American society at that time. Now, women during this time could not vote. Um, they were wards of their fathers until marriage. That means they were basically under their father's governance until they married and left. And then at that point, they were under their husband's governance. And beyond that, any property was immediately transferred to the husband, and he became the owner of any property she might have had or inherited. And if you notice what it says in here, at the very top it says keep within compass. And some of us might remember this instrument where we had to use in geometry class to make circles and stuff. It's always pointy, and somebody always ended up bleeding because of it. What this basically means is, in an 18th century kind of way, stay in your lane. Don't be uppity. Don't do things that you're not supposed to do. Know your place. And here we see little illustrations in the corner of what happens if, a woman does not do what she should. It looks like maybe she's poor here. She never found a husband. She's sobbing here. Maybe she lost her husband. I am not really sure what's going on in this one. But here we see this supposedly ideal image of her. Of course, dressed to the nines, super uncomfortably. That may lead us to think about how women's clothing moved to restrict their movement and to keep them, well, kind of immobile, and just looking demure and not really doing much of anything else. So, if you notice what it says here around this circle, it reads, keep within compass, and you shall be sure to avoid many troubles which others endure. And we actually have 4 different quatrains down here, all talking about things that women should avoid. I was able to zoom in on this on my other computer, and here she is playing cards, and here we've got like a little moralistic quatrain about what happens if you play cards. And here, yeah, I was right. I didn't want to say it before, but she's actually drinking, tippling away at a cordial. And here she's being lewd in some way. I don't know how exactly she's being lewd. Maybe somebody's seeing her ankle there. But that is something definitely to be avoided as well, and that's also representative down there in that quatrain. And if you don't avoid these things, you end up being poor. And it looks like maybe she's going to get the whip over there, the lash. Well, she's doing some kind of unpleasant work. Anyway, so the whole point is behave yourself. And I think it's, pretty fair for us to keep in mind that, there's a bit of a double standard here. So again, women are still nowhere near independence. A lot of you know already that, this year marks the 100th anniversary of women being able to vote. So that's not so long ago if you think about it. Coming up next, we'll talk about Jonathan Edwards, but I'm going to sign off for the night. Hope you like the videos. Make sure that you email me or text me if you got any questions.